My name is Cole Tanner. I'd accepted a quiet life fixing engines by a creek. One evening I saw a minivan stuck in mud, steam hissing. I helped a stranded mother patch the coolant line. From the back, triplets stared at me. When I finished, a little girl whispered, "Mister, we prayed for a daddy. Are you him?" The question hit like a stone. I couldn't shake it for a week. I tried to go back to my routines. The shop, the silence, the porch overlooking the creek. But those words echoed. A week later, I drove to the campground down the road and found them living in that minivan. The mother's name was Julia, and the triplets, Lily, Grace, and Hope, hadn't stopped asking about the man who fixed the car. She told me she'd fled an abusive situation with nothing but what she could pack in 30 minutes. They had no home, no family, no plan. Just a prayer whispered by 3 5-year-olds every night. That prayer landed on me, and I had to know why. I sat on a picnic table at that campground as the sun bled orange through the sycamores, watching Julia unpack a single duffel bag while the triplets drew pictures in the dirt with sticks. They were drawing a house, a big one, with a stick figure man standing out front. Lily looked up at me with those enormous, unblinking eyes and said, "That's you." The word hit me in the chest like a wrench slipping off a bolt. I'd spent 10 years building a life that didn't require anyone else. My repair shop was a converted pole barn with a hydraulic lift and a wood stove. My house was a 2-room cabin with a porch facing the creek and 0 pictures on the walls. I didn't own a television. I didn't own a phone that did anything but make calls. At 36 years old, I'd buried everyone I'd ever loved. My mother to cancer when I was 22, my father to a heart attack 6 months later, and then Kara. I never talked about Kara, not to anyone. She was the reason I moved out here in the first place. Julia didn't look at me with pity when she learned I lived alone. She looked at me like she was reading a map she'd already traveled. That first night at the campground, I brought a bag of groceries from the Dollar General. Canned soup, peanut butter, a loaf of bread, a gallon of milk. The triplets fell on the food like they hadn't eaten in 2 days. Julia's face went tight with shame. "We're fine," she said, the words automatic, a reflex worn smooth by too many years of pretending. I knelt down and handed Lily an apple. "It's just groceries," I said, "nothing else." Over the next few days, I kept finding reasons to drive past that campground. I told myself I was just checking on the coolant patch, but I'd already replaced the entire hose. I told myself the kids needed winter coats, so I dropped off 3 fleece jackets from the thrift store. Grace, the quietest one, wrapped her arms around my leg and whispered, "Thank you, Mr. Cole." I hadn't felt a child's hug in my entire adult life. I had to step away before Julia saw my eyes. By the 5th day, I'd learned the shape of Julia's story in fragments. She was 31. She'd married a man named Darren Kessler 8 years ago, right out of college, thinking she'd found the stable, protective partner her own father never was. Darren owned a small construction company in Dayton. He had a clean smile and a way of making every stranger feel important. Behind closed doors, he was a man who controlled everything she wore, every dollar she spent, every friend she kept. When the triplets came, a miracle, 3 bobbies from one desperate fertility treatment, he saw them not as daughters but as anchors that trapped her further. The abuse turned physical 3 years ago. Julia hid the bruises with long sleeves and foundation. She told no one because Darren knew people in the sheriff's department. He'd said more than once, "If you ever leave, I'll make sure you never see these kids again." And she believed him. Then, a month before I found her by the creek, she found a burner phone hidden in his truck, a phone he'd been using to arrange something she still wouldn't describe without shaking. That night, she packed 3 backpacks and the minivan and drove. No destination, just away. She'd been circling campgrounds and rest stops, living on cash drained from a secret savings account, waiting for the moment Darren would find them. But here's the thing that kept me awake at night. Those 3 little girls had never had a father who held them instead of hurting them. And every night they knelt in that minivan, clasped their tiny hands and prayed aloud for someone to come. Someone kind. Someone who would love their mom. And the night before their van broke down, Lily had added a new line to the prayer. "Please let him be outside when we need him." I didn't believe in signs. I believed in carburetors and torque specs and cause and effect. But standing in that campground, watching Hope tuck a wildflower behind her mother's ear, I felt the foundation of my carefully constructed solitude starting to crack. By the second week, the campground owner, a leather-skinned woman named Doris, stopped me at the gate. "You're that mechanic," she said. "The one who helped him." I nodded. She leaned on her truck and squinted at me. "I ain't supposed to let people stay this long without a proper site registration, but I seen the bruises on that woman's arms when she thought no one was looking. You gonna do something about that?" I didn't have an answer. Not yet. That evening, a cold front rolled in from the west. The temperature dropped into the 30s. I drove out and found the minivan windows fogged from the inside, the girls huddled under a single thin blanket. Julia's face was pale. "The heater doesn't work when the engine's off," she said, not meeting my eyes. "We'll be fine, we've done this before." I stood in the freezing dark and heard Lily coughing inside the van. I thought about my cabin, 2 rooms, empty walls, a wood stove that could burn all night, and something inside me broke loose. "No, you won't," I said. "You're coming with me tonight." Just until the cold passes. Julia stared at me like I'd offered her a life raft in the middle of an ocean and she was terrified it might be a trap. "Cole, if Darren finds out." "Let him find out," I said, and I was as surprised by the words as she was. "You don't have to be alone in this. Not anymore." She didn't answer. But when I opened the van door and held out my hand, she took it. The triplets climbed into my truck, wrapped in that one thin blanket, and I drove them to my cabin under a sky full of hard, cold stars. I didn't know then that Darren Kessler had already traced the minivan's last credit card purchase to a gas station 6 miles from my shop, or that he was driving through the night from Dayton, a loaded pistol in his glove box, and a phone full of threatening texts Julia hadn't dared to read. The only thing I knew, as I opened my front door and watched 3 5-year-olds step into the silence I'd guarded for a decade, was that something in that silence had just ended forever. That first night inside the cabin, I gave Julia my bedroom. The triplets slept on a mattress I dragged in from the storage loft, their 3 small bodies curled together like a litter of puppies. I took the couch by the wood stove. Every hour or so, I woke up and fed another split log into the fire. The wind outside howled through the creek valley, but inside, for the first time in years, the old cabin felt like it was breathing with more than one set of lungs. Julia woke before dawn. I heard her bare feet on the plank floor, then the soft sound of her checking on the girls. When she came into the main room, wrapped in one of my flannel shirts, she stopped in front of the wood stove and stared at the flames. "They haven't slept through the night in a month," she said quietly. "They feel safe here." I handed her a cup of coffee. "So do you," I said. She didn't answer, but she didn't disagree. For 3 days the cold front held. We fell into an unexpected rhythm. Julia cooked simple meals from the pantry, but she knew how to stretch a can of beans into something that tasted like comfort. The triplets explored every corner of the cabin, the yard, the shop. Hope found a box of old spark plugs and arranged them into a family. "This one's the daddy," she said, pointing to the biggest plug. Lily and Grace nodded solemnly. I felt my throat tighten and went outside to split firewood until my arms burned. By the 4th day, I drove into town for supplies. Wheatland was a single stoplight, a diner, a hardware store, and a bank. I'd been coming here for 10 years, and most people still called me that mechanic off Mill Creek Road rather than my name. I preferred it that way. But this time, when I walked into the diner to grab a sack of burgers, Dale the cook leaned over the counter and lowered his voice. "Some fella was in here yesterday asking about a woman with triplets, said he was her husband, showed a picture." My blood went cold. "What did you tell him?" Dale shrugged. "Nothing to tell, I ain't seen no triplets around here." He paused. "But I saw your truck pull in with 3 little girls in the back seat 2 days ago. Cole, you in trouble." I grabbed the food and left without answering. Back at the cabin, I told Julia everything. The color drained from her face. "He's here," she whispered. "He found us." The triplets were playing on the floor, stacking kindling into a log cabin. Grace looked up and asked, "Is Daddy coming to take us back?" The question carried the weight of everything she'd already survived at 5 years old. Julia knelt and pulled all 3 of them close. "No, baby, I won't let him." That evening, Doris from the campground drove her battered pickup up my lane. She'd never visited before. She climbed out with a shotgun in the rack behind her seat and a look on her face that said she'd seen too much in 70 years to be surprised by anything. "I got a nephew works dispatch at the sheriff's office," she said. "A man named Darren Kessler filed a report this morning. Says his wife kidnapped his children and is hiding out with some backwoods mechanic. Wants you arrested." She spat into the dirt. "My nephew flagged it for me because he knew I'd want to know. Sheriff's deputy is supposed to come out tomorrow." Julia sat down hard on the porch step. "Kidnapping," she said. "He's going to twist this around and make me the criminal." I turned to Doris. "Does your nephew know what kind of man Darren Kessler is?" Doris looked at me steadily. "He knows there's been plenty of calls to that house over the years and not a single one ever got followed up on. Darren's got a cousin in the department. That's why my nephew flagged it. He's one of the good ones. But the sheriff, he'll do what the cousin says." She handed me a folded piece of paper with a name and number. "Before you do anything else, call this woman. Her name is Renee Harper. She runs a legal aid clinic in Columbus. She's been fighting domestic custody cases for 20 years. And she owes me a favor from when her car broke down on a camping trip in '94. I called Renee Harper that night while Julia put the girls to bed. I told her everything: the abuse, the escape, the burner phone, the prayer, the cold front, the kidnapping report. Renee listened without interrupting, and when I finished, she said 4 words that changed the trajectory of everything. "Where's the burner phone?" Julia had it. She'd kept it in her bag since the night she fled, too terrified to look at its contents. "I only ever checked the messages that first night," she said. "I saw enough to know Darren was involved in things I didn't want to understand. I was afraid if I dug deeper, he'd somehow know." Renee's voice came through the speaker, calm and surgical. "Julia, if that phone contains evidence of criminal activity beyond domestic abuse, and from what you've described it does, then Darren doesn't control the narrative anymore. The evidence does, but you need to back it up. Now, before he has a chance to take it from you." Julia's hands shook as she powered on the phone. The battery was at 4%. She scrolled through text messages, photographs, attachments. Her face went from pale to ashen. "Cole," she said, her voice barely a whisper, "he's not just abusive. He's been running a scheme through his construction company, inflating invoices on government contracts, kickbacks to a county commissioner. And there's more." She stopped at a series of messages that referenced a storage unit near the Ohio River. "I think he's been hiding things. Money, documents, maybe worse." At that moment, headlights swept across the window. Someone was coming up the lane, a truck moving fast. I told Julia to take the girls into the bedroom and lock the door. I grabbed the pistol I kept in the shop, a Ruger I'd never fired at anything but targets, and stepped onto the porch. Darren Kessler climbed out of a black Silverado alone. He was bigger than I expected. 6'2", 220 pounds of gym muscle and bottled rage. He wore a Carhartt jacket and new boots, and he carried a confidence that only comes from years of never being told no. "You must be the mechanic," he said, the word mechanic twisted into something dirty. "I'm here to collect my wife and daughters. You've got 5 minutes to hand them over before I call the sheriff and have you arrested for harboring a fugitive." I kept the gun at my side, pointed at the ground. "Julia isn't going anywhere with you. Not tonight. Not ever." Darren laughed, a flat, humorless sound. "You think you know her? She's my wife, the mother of my children. She belongs with me. And you're a lonely man who saw a stranded woman and decided to play hero. But this isn't a movie. This is real life. And in real life, the hero loses everything." He took a step toward the porch. I raised the pistol. "Another step and this stops being a conversation." Darren stopped. His eyes went cold. "You pull that trigger, you'll spend the rest of your life in prison. I've got friends in the department, friends on the bench. You'll be a headline for a day and then you'll be forgotten." He smiled, and it was the smile of a man who'd spent a lifetime learning exactly where the pressure points were. "But I'm not going to make you shoot me. I'm going to do something much worse. I'm going to take away everything you've built. That shop, I know your lender, I know your clients. By the end of the month, every one of them will be gone. Your land, I'll contest the title. Your reputation, I'll make sure every newspaper in the county runs the story of the backwoods mechanic who kidnapped 3 little girls. And when you're broken and alone, I'll still be here. And Julia and my daughters will be home where they belong." He got back in his truck and drove away, but not before rolling down the window and delivering one last shot. Check your mailbox in the morning, Cole. You're about to learn what happens when you get between a man and his family. The next morning, a certified letter arrived from the bank. My loan $22,000 on the shop and cabin was being called in. Full payment due in 14 days. The reasons cited: violation of community standards clause and pending legal action. Darren had made good on his threat before the sun was even up. But that wasn't the worst of it. At 11 o'clock, a sheriff's cruiser pulled into my yard. Deputy Marcus Webb stepped out, Doris's nephew. I recognized the name from the paper she'd given me. He looked like he hadn't slept. Behind him, a woman in a county social services jacket climbed out of the passenger side clutching a clipboard. "Mr. Tanner," Deputy Webb said, "this is Ms. Ainsley from Child Protective Services. We have a court order to take the Kessler children into protective custody pending a custody hearing, based on allegations of an unsafe living environment and parental kidnapping." Julia came out onto the porch. The triplets huddled behind her legs. "Please," she said, "you don't understand. I took them to protect them. Their father is dangerous." Ms. Ainsley's face was professionally neutral. "Ma'am, we have a sworn statement from the father alleging neglect and endangerment. Until a judge can review the full circumstances, the children need to be placed in a neutral location." I stepped between them and the family. "And where is this neutral location?" I asked. Deputy Webb looked at the ground. Ms. Ainsley checked her clipboard. "It will be a licensed foster facility in the county." I caught Webb's eye. "Is that facility run by anyone connected to Darren Kessler?" Webb didn't answer. He didn't have to. Julia fell to her knees and wrapped her arms around her daughters. Lily looked up at me, tears streaming down her cheeks. "Mr. Cole," she whispered, "you said we'd be safe here." Those words cut deeper than anything Darren had threatened. And then, as the social worker stepped forward to take the children, a sound cut through the yard. A phone ringing from inside the cabin. Renee Harper calling back. I ran inside and grabbed it. Her voice was urgent but steady. "Cole, I just checked the county clerk's records. The judge assigned to your case." His campaign was heavily funded by Kessler Construction. But here's what Darren doesn't know. I found the storage unit Julia mentioned in that burner phone. Unit 37 at Riverfront Storage in Marietta. And what's inside it? Evidence of wire fraud, bribery, and a safe containing documents that connect Darren Kessler to something much bigger than a custody dispute. If we can get to that unit before Darren realizes we know about it, we flip the entire board. I turned and looked out at the yard where Deputy Webb was quietly telling Ms. Ainsley to give us a moment. The triplets were still crying. Julia was still on her knees, and I made a decision that would either save us all or destroy everything. "Renee," I said, "get in your car. We're going to Marietta tonight." I hung up the phone and stepped back onto the porch. Deputy Webb was standing between Julia and the social worker, one hand raised in a gesture that said, "Give me a minute." He'd heard me say Marietta. He was smart enough to know it meant something. "Webb," I said, keeping my voice low so Ainsley couldn't hear, "I need you to trust me. We have evidence that Darren Kessler has been running a fraud scheme through government contracts. Physical evidence in a storage unit near the river. If we get it, it doesn't just clear Julia. It brings down a county commissioner and anyone else protecting him. But I have to go tonight, and I can't let those girls be taken while I'm gone." Webb looked at me for a long 10 seconds. I could see the gears turning behind his tired eyes. He'd spent years watching the same men protect each other while cases disappeared into filing cabinets. "I can stall the custody transfer for 24 hours, he said finally. "I'll tell Ainsley there's conflicting information that needs verification before removal. She won't like it, but I outrank her on the scene." He turned to Ms. Ainsley and spoke with the flat authority of a man who knew exactly how much rope he was giving himself. "Ma'am, I'm invoking a temporary custody hold pending further investigation. The children will remain in the care of their mother under my supervision until I've verified several new allegations. You can file a report, but I'm not releasing them tonight." Ainsley's mouth tightened. "This is highly irregular, Deputy." The court order didn't mention the part where the father has an open fraud investigation," Webb cut in. You want to be the social worker who handed 3 kids back to a man about to be indicted. Be my guest." She didn't. She climbed back into the cruiser and drove away, leaving Webb standing in the yard with a look that said his career was probably over but his conscience was finally clean. Julia, still on her knees, looked up at me with an expression I couldn't fully read. "Go," she said. "Get the evidence, I'll keep them safe." I looked at the triplets still huddled in the doorway, their eyes wet but no longer panicked. Grace raised her hand in a tiny wave. "We'll be good, Mr. Cole," she said. "We'll pray for you." I knelt down to her level. "You already did," I said. "That's how this started." Doris showed up 10 minutes later with a thermos of coffee and her shotgun. "I'll stay with them," she said. "Anybody comes up that lane who ain't you or the deputy, they'll meet Granny's persuader." She racked the pump once for emphasis. I didn't ask questions. I just nodded and got in the truck. The drive to Marietta took 2 hours. Julia sat beside me in the cab, the burner phone in her lap with a map pulled up on the cracked screen. The night was cold and moonless, the kind of dark that makes every pair of headlights in the rearview mirror feel like a threat. For the first 40 minutes, neither of us spoke. Then Julia broke the silence. "Do you want to know what I saw on that phone the first night?" she asked. Her voice was flat, reciting a report she'd been writing in her head for weeks. Messages, dozens of them, between Darren and a man named Harlan Thorne. Thorne is the county commissioner for infrastructure. He approves every major road contract in the region. Darren's company would bid low, win the contract, then submit inflated change orders. Thorne signed off on every one. They split the overrun 70-30. In 3 years, they skimmed over $2 million from public funds. She paused. "But that's not what kept me up." She turned the screen toward me. It showed a photograph of a document, a trust agreement. "My father set up a trust for the triplets before he died. $500,000 to be released when they turn 18. I didn't know about it. My father never told me, but Darren found out. And the messages show he was working with a lawyer to have me declared mentally unfit so he could be named the trustee." My hands tightened on the steering wheel. "He wasn't just trying to control you," I said. "He was trying to control $500,000 meant for your daughters." Julia nodded, tears welling again. "The abuse, the isolation, the threats, it was all building to this. He was going to have me committed, Cole. There are emails where they discuss which facilities are hardest to get out of." That revelation settled into the cab like a third passenger. I thought about my own father, who'd left me nothing but this land and a shop full of tools, but who'd never once made me feel like a transaction. And here was a man who'd looked at 3 little girls and seen only dollar signs. "We're going to make sure he never touches that money," I said, "or those girls, ever again." Riverfront Storage sat on a bend of the Muskingum River, a cluster of corrugated metal buildings surrounded by a chain-link fence with a broken gate. Unit 37 was at the far end, padlocked but otherwise unguarded. Julia had the key code from a message Darren had sent to Thorne 6 months ago, 4729. The lock clicked open. Inside, the unit was packed with file boxes, a metal desk, and a floor safe bolted to the concrete. We started with the boxes. Invoices. Canceled checks. A ledger with handwritten notes in 2 different hands, Darren's blocky script and Thorne's looping signature. Everything laid out like a confession. But the safe was the real prize. We didn't have the combination, but Julia remembered something from the messages. Darren always used the same 6 digits for everything, his own birth date backwards. 786491. I spun the dial. The safe opened with a heavy thunk. Inside there were 3 things: a stack of cash thick enough to choke a horse, a 9mm pistol with a scratched serial number, and a black USB drive wrapped in paper that read Insurance HT in Darren's handwriting. We had our evidence. And then the headlights came. A car pulled into the lot and stopped directly in front of the unit. A door opened, footsteps. I grabbed Julia and pulled her behind the desk. A man's voice called out, "Tanner, I know you're in there. My cousin Darren said you might poke around, said to make sure you didn't leave with anything important." It was Levi Kessler, the cousin in the sheriff's department, the one who'd buried every domestic call Julia had ever made. I could hear the weight of a duty belt creaking, the click of a holster unsnapped. "You're trespassing, Tanner, breaking and entering. I've got every right to shoot an intruder." I pulled the 9mm from the safe, Darren's own gun, irony of ironies, and checked the magazine. Full. I whispered to Julia, "Stay down." Then I stood up slowly, weapon at my side but not raised. "Deputy Kessler, you here on official business or family business? Because one of those gets you a pension and the other gets you disbarred." He stepped into the light. He was tall like Darren but thinner, meaner, the kind of cop who'd learned early that a badge was a weapon. "Official business," he said, but the smile on his face was all family. "I got a report of a break-in." Imagine my surprise when it turns out to be the man who kidnapped my cousin's wife. "You know, the sad thing is, I could have just arrested you at your cabin. This, this is so much better. Now I get to say I caught you red-handed with stolen property and a firearm with an obliterated serial number. You'll be in prison for 20 years and Julia will be back in Darren's house by the weekend." He raised his weapon, and in that moment, a second set of headlights blazed through the unit, blinding him. A voice from outside, sharp and authoritative. "Deputy Kessler, put the gun down. This is Deputy Marcus Webb of the Wheatland Sheriff's Department, and I am accompanied by Special Agent Janine Acaffer of the Ohio Bureau of Criminal Investigation, the BCI. Renee Harper hadn't just called me back, she'd called the state. Webb must have tipped her off that we were heading into a trap." Kessler's face went rigid. "This is county business. BCI has no jurisdiction." Agent Acaffer stepped into the light, a woman in her 40s with a no-nonsense face and a vest that said state agent. "When the county business involves wire fraud, bribery of a public official, conspiracy to commit involuntary commitment, and a serial number scraped off a firearm found in a storage unit tied to a county commissioner, BCI has all the jurisdiction it needs. Put the weapon down, deputy. That's an order." Kessler's hand trembled. For a long, terrible second, I thought he might fire anyway. Then the gun clattered to the concrete. Webb moved in and cuffed him while Acaffer kept her weapon trained on him without expression. She looked at me and Julia. "Is the evidence secure?" Julia held up the USB drive. "It's all here. The fraud, the bribes, the plan to have me committed, everything." Acaffer nodded once. "Then let's go. We've got a commissioner to arrest and a custody hearing to overturn, and you two have a long night ahead." We drove back to Wheatland in a convoy, Webb leading, Acaffer following, and Julia and I in the truck with the evidence bagged on the seat between us. The sky was just starting to lighten in the east when we pulled into my lane. Doris was still there, sitting on the porch with the shotgun across her knees and the triplets asleep in a pile of blankets at her feet. Julia ran to them and fell to her knees, pulling all three against her chest. Lily stirred and mumbled, "Did Mr. Cole come back?" Julia looked up at me with eyes that held everything: gratitude, fear, and something I was almost afraid to name. "Yes, baby. He came back." Acaffer left with the evidence and a promise to have arrest warrants issued by noon. Webb went home to write the report that would either make his career or end it, but he was smiling for the first time since I'd met him. And I sat on the porch as the sun came up, Julia beside me, the triplets in our laps, watching the light hit the creek and knowing that the fight wasn't over, but it had finally turned. The next morning, everything accelerated. Acaffer's team arrested Harlan Thorne at his home at 6 a.m. and Darren Kessler at his office an hour later. The USB drive contained not just the financial records, but also video recordings from a hidden camera Darren had placed in Thorne's office. Insurance, just as the note said. The videos showed Thorne explicitly agreeing to the fraud, discussing the bribery payouts, and in one chilling clip, agreeing to help Darren manage the Julia problem by pressuring a judge to sign the competency order. That video alone was enough to vacate every custody ruling Darren had ever obtained. By noon, Renee Harper had filed an emergency motion to dismiss the CPS case with prejudice. The judge who'd been assigned, suddenly aware that his campaign donor was under federal investigation, recused himself within the hour. A new judge, Judge Patricia Okonkwo, was appointed. She had a reputation for being unimpressed by money and immune to political pressure. She reviewed the evidence and issued a sweeping ruling. The children were to remain with Julia. The kidnapping charge against me was dismissed with a finding of factual innocence, and a temporary restraining order was issued barring Darren from any contact with Julia or the girls pending the criminal trial. But here's what nobody expected. As Darren sat in the county jail, still wearing his construction company polo shirt, he made a phone call to a number we didn't know he had. And within 4 hours, a document landed on Judge Okonkwo's desk, a motion alleging that the evidence in the storage unit had been obtained through an illegal search, that Agent Okafor's involvement was improper, and that the entire case was a conspiracy orchestrated by Julia and her lover, the mechanic. It was signed by a law firm out of Columbus, one of the most expensive defense firms in the state. Darren wasn't giving up. He was digging in. We had one night to prepare for the hearing that would determine whether Julia kept her daughters, whether I went to jail, and whether a corrupt network that had operated in plain sight for years would finally be held accountable. Every secret we had was about to be dragged into the light, and the only way to win was to walk into that courtroom and show them that the truth, once spoken, could not be silenced by money or fear. We didn't sleep that night. Renee Harper spread her files across my kitchen table, a war room of paper and highlighter and cold coffee. Julia sat beside her, the triplets asleep in the bedroom with Doris standing guard. Webb arrived at midnight with a manila envelope. Inside were sworn statements from 3 former employees of Kessler Construction who had come forward after hearing about the arrests, each one detailing falsified safety reports, wage theft, and the time Darren had threatened to bury one worker alive if he talked. Webb looked at me across the table. It's not just fraud anymore, it's racketeering. The feds are taking over tomorrow morning. That changed the math. A state custody hearing was one thing. A federal investigation was a tidal wave that no expensive law firm could dam. Renee used the envelope to rewrite her entire strategy. We're not just defending Julia, she said. We're burying Darren so deep he'll never see daylight again. And the beauty of it is the evidence came from his own safe. He built the trap himself. Morning arrived pale and hard. The Washington County Courthouse stood at the center of town, limestone and pillars and a flag snapping in a cold wind. When we pulled up, a line of news vans was already parked along the curb. The story had broken. County commissioner implicated in fraud ring, local mechanic cleared of kidnapping, mother fights for custody against abusive husband. People I'd never met held signs outside the courthouse door. Justice for Julia. Protect the triplets. One woman caught my eye and mouthed, "Thank you." I didn't know what to do with that. Inside, the courtroom smelled of old wood and floor polish. Darren sat at the defendant's table in a charcoal suit that probably cost more than my truck. His lawyer, a silver-haired man named Covington with a $900 an hour reputation, was arranging binders like chess pieces. Darren looked relaxed, cocky. He caught Julia's eye and smiled, and it was the same smile he'd worn on my porch when he promised to destroy everything I'd built. Julia's hand found mine under the table. "He still thinks he's going to win," she whispered. "He has no idea what's coming." Judge Okonkwo entered and the room rose. She was a compact woman with sharp eyes and zero tolerance for theatrics. She read the docket with a voice that could cut stone. Then she looked at Covington. "Counselor, you filed a motion to suppress all physical evidence obtained from riverfront storage, alleging Fourth Amendment violations and improper state involvement. You have 20 minutes. Make it good." Covington stood and wove a story about private citizens acting as agents of the state, about Agent Okafor's arrival being prearranged, about an illegal fishing expedition conducted by a jealous mechanic and a desperate woman. He was smooth. He was persuasive. And he was missing one critical fact. Renee stood up and said 7 words that sucked the air out of the room. Cole Tanner was never a state agent. She walked toward the bench, holding a copy of a Supreme Court precedent. Private searches are not subject to the Fourth Amendment unless the private party is acting at the direction of law enforcement. Agent Okafor was called after the evidence was found, precisely because we wanted BCI to secure the chain of custody properly. The defendant's own cousin, a sheriff's deputy, was caught on body camera attempting to intimidate witnesses and obstruct the recovery of evidence. He is currently in custody. The USB drive, the ledgers, the safe, all of it was found by Mr. Tanner and Ms. Kessler, private citizens on private property they accessed with a valid key code. There is no violation. There is, however, overwhelming evidence of multiple felonies. The judge's face was unreadable. She denied the motion to suppress without a second of deliberation. Covington's jaw tightened. He wasn't used to losing on procedural grounds, but the real blow was still coming. Agent Acaffer took the stand. She was clinical, methodical, and devastating. She described the contents of the USB, the videos of Thorne, the bank records, the emails about the competency order. She read aloud from one message Darren had sent to Thorne. "The wife is becoming a problem. I've got a doc ready to sign off on an involuntary 5150. Once she's locked up, the trust goes to me. I'll make sure the girls are taken care of." She paused. He meant taken care of financially. But the implication was clear. He was willing to have his wife institutionalized to get control of her father's money. A gasp ran through the courtroom. I looked at Darren. He wasn't smiling anymore. Renee called the three former employees. One of them, a grizzled man named Earl Mackey, took the stand with trembling hands. He'd worked for Darren for 12 years. He described being ordered to pour watered-down concrete on a school job, told to forge inspection reports, and threatened with physical violence when he complained. He pulled up his shirt to show a scar across his ribs. He said if I ever talked, he'd make sure my grandkids didn't have a roof. By the time Earl stepped down, the courtroom was silent as a held breath. Then came the moment that I will never forget. Renee called Julia to the stand. She walked past Darren without looking at him, sat in the witness chair, and for the first time in 8 years told the entire truth in public. She described the years of isolation, the fists, the apologies, the hospital visits she lied about, the night he'd threatened to hurt the triplets if she ever left. She was shaking, but she didn't stop. "I didn't run away because I wanted to," she said, her voice cracking but clear. "I ran because I finally believed he would kill me, and I couldn't let my daughters grow up with a dead mother and a monster for a father." Judge Okonkwo leaned forward. "Ms. Kessler, you said the triplets prayed for someone to help. Who did they pray for?" Julia looked across the room at me, sitting in the gallery with the girls not present but their presence felt. "They prayed for a daddy, a real one, the kind who protects, not hurts. They didn't know who it would be. They just believed someone would come. And when our van broke down by a creek in the middle of nowhere and a quiet man with grease on his hands stopped to help, my 5-year-old looked at him and asked, 'Are you the one we prayed for?' Her voice broke entirely. I think she was right." The judge sat back. Covington tried to cross-examine, to paint Julia as a manipulator, but every question only reinforced her credibility. By the end, even he seemed to know it was over. The ruling came at 4:30 in the afternoon. Judge Okonkwo spoke with the weight of someone who understood exactly what she was doing. Full legal and physical custody of Lily, Grace, and Hope Kessler is awarded to Julia Kessler, effective immediately and permanently. All charges against Cole Tanner are dismissed with prejudice, and a finding of factual innocence is entered into the record. The bank's acceleration of Mr. Tanner's loan is declared null and void due to improper influence by a party under federal investigation. She turned to Darren. "Mr. Kessler, you are to be remanded into federal custody on charges including but not limited to wire fraud, bribery, conspiracy, and domestic violence. The bailiff will take you now." Darren stood up, his composure cracking for the first time. He looked at me, and in his eyes was the hatred of a man who'd never once been held accountable. He opened his mouth to speak, but the bailiff was already there, and whatever he wanted to say died in the hallway. Outside the courthouse, the crowd erupted, but I barely heard any of it. I was looking at Julia, who stood on the steps with the afternoon sun in her hair, the triplets clinging to her legs, their faces lit up with a joy I hadn't seen since I'd met them. Lily pulled away and ran toward me. I knelt down and she threw her arms around my neck. "I prayed for you before I ever met you," she whispered. "God told me you were coming." I held her tight, unable to speak. That evening we drove home in a pickup loaded with flowers people had handed us on the courthouse steps. The cabin felt different now, full of noise and laughter, and the smell of Doris's famous chili, which she'd cooked in celebration. Webb stopped by with a case of beer and a grin that said his career had survived. Renee called to tell us that the federal indictment had expanded to include RICO charges, which meant Darren was looking at life. And as the sun set behind the wheat fields, No, maybe I'd imagined wheat. It was the Creek Valley. We all gathered on the porch, a strange, assembled family bound together by a broken van and a whispered prayer. But the most surprising detail came later that night, after everyone had left. Julia and I sat on the porch steps, watching the fireflies blink in the dark. She reached into her pocket and pulled out a folded piece of paper, yellow with age. "This was in the safe," she said. "Along with the USB drive. I didn't show it to anyone." She handed it to me. It was a letter written in a shaky hand, dated 6 years earlier. It was from her father, the man who'd set up the trust, who'd known about Darren's nature long before anyone else. He'd written, "Jules, if you're reading this, I'm gone and you found the safe. I knew what Darren was. I couldn't prove it in time. So I put this here, hoping someone would help you find the truth, protect my granddaughters. And if you find someone who loves you the way your mother loved me, hold on to them. Not everyone will stop to fix a broken car." I read the paper 3 times and every hair on my arm stood up. He'd known. He'd predicted it. He'd woven a safety net from beyond the grave, trusting that someday, somehow, a stranger would turn up at exactly the right moment. I looked at Julia, and she looked at me, and neither of us said anything for a long time. Then she leaned her head on my shoulder. "What happens now?" she asked. I thought about the quiet life I'd built, the walls I'd put up, the solitude I'd thought would keep me safe from ever losing anyone again. And I thought about 3 little girls who'd prayed for a daddy and a woman who'd survived hell and a God who'd somehow threaded a prayer through a broken coolant line to land me on a muddy road just in time. "Now," I said, "we build something together." And that was only the beginning of everything that would come next. 6 months after the trial, I stood in the creek behind the cabin and watched Lily, Grace, and Hope splash in the shallows with a joy that had no shadows in it. Julia sat on the bank with her feet in the water, the letter from her father folded in her pocket. The bank loan was paid off, thanks to a settlement from the state for wrongful prosecution. My repair shop had more business than ever because people in town had stopped calling me that mechanic off Mill Creek and started calling me by my name. Cole, just Cole, and that was enough. Darren Kessler was sentenced to 37 years in federal prison. Harlan Thorne got 20. Deputy Levi Kessler was stripped of his badge and awaits his own trial. The system, for once, worked, but only because a handful of people refused to look away. A deputy who risked his career. A grandmother with a shotgun and a conscience, a legal aid attorney who took a call from a stranger, and 3 little girls who never stopped believing that someone was listening to their prayers. Here's the thing I've learned. I spent a decade hiding from the world, convinced that solitude was safer than risking loss again. But love doesn't work like that. It shows up uninvited, in a broken-down minivan, in a whispered question from a 5-year-old, in a muddy creek crossing where your old life ends and a new one begins. You don't get to choose the moment. You only get to choose what you do when it arrives. I'm not a religious man, not in the church on Sunday sense, but I can't explain what happened by that creek. I can't explain how a prayer spoken in the back of a minivan found its answer in the hands of a mechanic who just happened to be passing by. Maybe it was God, maybe it was luck. Maybe those two things are the same thing dressed in different words. All I know is that 3 children asked for a father and I got to become one. Julia and I got married last fall on the same porch where I'd once stood alone watching the seasons change. The triplets wore dresses they picked out themselves, mismatched socks and all. Grace held the rings. Hope carried flowers. And Lily, the one who'd whispered the question that started everything, stood beside me and said, "I told you God was listening." She was right. The house doesn't feel quiet anymore. It's full of crayon drawings on the refrigerator and muddy boots by the door and laughter that echoes through rooms that used to hold only silence. I still fix engines. Julia runs a garden that feeds half the county. And every night, when the triplets kneel beside their beds to say their prayers, they don't ask for a daddy anymore. They just say thank you. If this story found you in a season of solitude, in a moment where you've settled for silence because you're afraid of what might happen if you let someone in, let me tell you something I know now to be true. The thing you're most afraid of losing is often the thing you most need to risk. And sometimes, the prayer you didn't know you were praying has already been answered. It just might be waiting for you on a muddy road in the form of a stranger in the moment you decide to stop and help. Thank you for watching. If you believe that second chances are real and that kindness can change the course of a life, subscribe to this channel. Tap the bell so you never miss a story. Share this with someone who needs to hear it. And remember, you don't have to be perfect to be someone's answer to a prayer. You just have to show up.